Hey everyone, we're back here talking about E&E News' coverage of the midterm elections, and today we want to focus on one of the more important states this year, Florida. Tons of races with particular importance to energy and environment and climate politics. And here we have Mark Matthews, who just got back from the Sunshine State.
I did, a little bit of tan.
Even when it was kind of cloudy down there, right?
It was not bad. I mean, I was in Miami, so there was plenty of sun.
Okay. So yeah, tell me a little bit about where you went, what you were looking for, and what you ended up finding.
Sure. So I went on a road trip swing that began in Sarasota, bounced over to Orlando, dropped down to the Fort Lauderdale area, and ended in Miami. So put a lot of miles under the rental car, but that was fine. And the reason I started in Sarasota was because I was looking at Florida's 16th district race between incumbent Vern Buchanan and his challenger, David Shapiro. And why I'm interested in that race is because that is an area where you have seen a lot of red tide. And red tide is this like toxic algae outbreak that is spread across particularly the Gulf Coast, although now it's popping up a little bit on the Atlantic side. And it has been going on for months. It has devastated like the industry down there. Tourism has dropped. At one point I was in Sarasota, which is this sleepy, well-off town on the Gulf Coast, and I was talking to some people there, and they said like the downtown was a ghost town when it was that bad because the smell was terrible. People didn't want to go to the beach. If you had asthma and you went there, you would have trouble breathing. I mean, this is like, what is Florida other than its beaches? And for so much of the state, it had been knocked out. And you're seeing kind of red tide pop up in a bunch of different races across the state. In the governor's race, in the Senate race, in the House races like Vern Buchanan. So that's where I wanted to drop in because it feels to me like Sarasota was one of the areas that had been most hard hit.
And how is it making a difference?
So David Shapiro is trying to make an issue of this. He took it out an ad that was blaming Vern Buchanan for some of the problems, for not doing enough for environmental protection, trying to tie him to Florida's sugar industry, kind of known derisively in the state as Big Sugar for a lot of their work around Lake Okeechobee and everything on there. So he's kind of pushing on that and trying to put that blame there. He's having some trouble. I mean, this is a Republican-leaning district. You know, Buchanan has been in office for several terms, but you know, it's trying to make a punch. People are noticing, and it's not just because of the very, like, I guess 10,000 foot. Well, we care about the environment. These are people's livelihoods. I just got off a follow-up phone call today with a political science professor down at Broward College in Florida, and she was saying that this type of thing is not just affecting like the beaches and the hotels. It affects folks who are like musicians down in Florida because here's the thing. If you have this beach community that's not getting the tourists, that means the restaurants are going to not need as many workers, and they're not going to be able to pay musicians who normally play. I mean, to say that tourism is important to Florida's economy is understating. It is integral to the economy, and red tide gets at that, and that is a big problem. And so, Vern Buchanan, for his part, he's pushing back. He's saying that he's supported some research into red tide. He flagged kind of an amendment that he got to a bill, but Shapiro is one of many lawmakers or politicians that are trying to make that argument. You're seeing it too in Brian Mast's district. He's been affected not by red tide but green slime. Right,
and we should kind of stress that these are different issues. Red tide is out in the ocean. The green slime, it's basically starts in Lake Okeechobee and then runs out from there out into the coast.
To the waterways, and it's affecting again the tourism, but also just people's quality of life in Florida, right? So I mean, if you're well off enough in the state, you're gonna get you own a boat, and that's why you moved to Florida, so you can have a boat. But if your boat and the canals are all covered in slime, that makes for not a good day. And so people are starting to take these issues and talk about it in all these different races. And while I was in Orlando, there was a rally there that Joe Biden did for Bill Nelson, who's running for Senate against Governor Rick Scott, as well as a couple local candidates, including Stephanie Murphy, who's a local congresswoman in Central Florida. And Nelson has been in office forever. I mean, 30 years, 40 years. He's been in office for a very long time. And so he gets in front of the crowd and doesn't get the typical stump speech, but he gets everybody fired up by talking about Red Tide Rick. That was the most animated I saw the crowd while he was there at that Biden rally, because everyone is concerned about red tide, and Democrats and liberals are trying to attach that label to Governor Rick Scott.
Is it working?
I mean, I feel like of all the climate change or environmental or political issues, the biggest potency, I think, is this red tide issue, and I think it matters to folks. Again, going back to this is not some nebulous thing like polar bears not having a habitat. This is frankly people's own self-interest. I can't go to the beach. This bothers me.
Exactly.
Who do I got to vote out, or what do I got to do to be able to make a difference?
And is it harder for the Democrats to point blame, since the research shows us that the reasons for the red tide it's murkier than something like the blue-green algae. My understanding is that there's still a lot of research to be done on the red tide, and the tie and the connection with agriculture is less direct.
Yes, there is I think in terms of also talking about how much carbon in the atmosphere affects red tide buildup, the I guess the warmth of the water, also these factors. But again, this is politics. This is campaign season. At some point, you don't have to over-explain it. And I think that the Dems are just trying to use it as a bludgeon to try to get to do it, and they worrying less about trying to explain. Well, red tide. If you carry the one and do this, and it'd be like red tide, Rick. You say that enough times, it starts to make a difference, and that's why I think there's potency, because you don't have to explain it. It's just a catchy slogan. I think they even have a song about it, about what's happening, and so. And it was interesting too. At that same rally, Biden was talking about climate change for a good long time as being a major national security issue. So if and when he pursues this 2020 run, I think you're going to see him make a case for climate change as a national security issue.
And try to win over Florida, which has win over Democrats.
One of my conversations while I was down there was with former Senator Mel Martinez, a Republican who represented the state for several years, and he had the same thought. He was like, "Look, this is a landmark election for Florida. Whoever runs for president in 2020 is going to have to address these issues in the state, because they're not going anywhere. This is here to stay." And to hear someone like Mel Martinez, Republican long-term person in the state, I think is significant. I think it's starting to change. I mean, you're starting to see some of the other candidates talk about stuff like this.
Now, here's an interesting question: we've been talking about Florida and climate change. It seems that the red tide and the blue-green algae, while extremely important, is kind of taking the attention a little bit away from climate change. Any perspective on that?
Well, I mean, they're related in a way.
In a way.
And so, but I think all of these things come together. And don't forget the hurricane. Hurricane Michael, slammed the Panhandle, a couple weeks ago. And and people are again trying to make that argument about climate change, that you had this storm that rapidly intensified into almost a Category 5, and people say again the warming waters of the Gulf of Mexico contributed to that. That's part of the reason. And frankly, if there is going to be a direct impact on climate change on the election in Florida this year, it may just be the fact that a rapidly intensified hurricane slammed Florida's Panhandle, where Rick Scott, and Ron DeSantis count on a lot of their support. And you can see that the early voting returns from the counties that were hit by the hurricane are way low, by far the worst in the state. And so, if you have another election decided by 500 or so votes in Florida, you might look to simply just the disaster that is the Panhandle right now. I mean, it's terrible. We were looking to go up there.
Yeah.
But right now, that in terms of just getting around the lines for the gas, it's nuts. It's nuts. And so that was that's what I was doing in Orlando. When I went down to Davie, Florida, and the Fort Lauderdale area, that I got a chance. I got front row seats. Well, not quite front row, but I was there for a knockdown, drag-out fight between Andrew Gillum and Ron DeSantis in their debate for governor.
Right.
And these guys, gloves off. It was it was all the way. And it's really interesting to hear the two of them kind of talk about environmental issues. So, Ron DeSantis did a couple significant things in his upset victory in the Republican primary. So he was running against Adam Putnam. And I knew Putnam when he was still a congressman up here. I mean, total wonder kid. I mean, young guy. He got to the echelons of leadership here in the House, and decided to go back to Florida 8 years ago. And the reason was, he had a young family, and he was going to go and become Florida's Commissioner of Agriculture. His family was in the citrus business for a long time. Here was a chance for him to leave D.C., probably at about the right time before things got totally crazy. Raise his family, build his profile, get his support. Everybody knew that Adam Putnam was running for governor for 10 years. Sets everything in motion after Rick Scott, and he just gets completely blindsided by Ron DeSantis. And that happened for two reasons. The first is that President Trump got big behind Ron DeSantis, the point where DeSantis did that television ad that everybody remembers, showing his kid, how do you build that wall with building blocks, right? And the second thing, and the more interesting thing for our purposes, is that he took on Big Sugar. That Big Sugar was all behind Ron DeSantis. All behind Adam Putnam. And DeSantis took it on, and he did the thing of tying Big Sugar to Red Tide and tying Adam Putnam to Big Sugar and Red Tide, and that seemed to have an effect. I mean, something else that Mel Martinez, he's no one has really ever done that to take, especially not a Republican, to take on Big Sugar, and those combinations then put DeSantis over the top in the Republican primary.
And that's interesting, having a conservative, pro-business Republican being against one of the state's top businesses.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a seismic change in a way. And so, I was kind of joking around with some other folks about okay, well, what does that mean for climate change policy in the race for governor? And I was saying that if DeSantis had a slogan, it would be build that seawall. He does, in a way, he doesn't really talk about climate change. In fact, when I try to get some people to his campaign, they're well, does he believe the climate science? I haven't really even got a clear answer on that. But when he does talk about it, he talks about resiliency. He talks about building seawalls. He talks about preparing the place for daytime flooding down there and doing all that. And so it's less about mitigation and more about adaptation.
And is that enough to convince a lot of people down there?
I mean, it's a way, and I talked to a political professor today, they're it's a way that you can try to begin to talk about it, without maybe alienating some people who are more conservative, center-right, that kind of thing. Meanwhile, the Dems are having none of it.
Exactly.
They're no, this is not enough, this is not happening. I mean, another race that I was looking at is Carlos Curbello's fight to keep in Florida's 26th district. This includes the Keys, and if there's a part of the U.S. that's going to be underwater in terms of climate change, the Keys are going to go first, or going to be the ones that are going to go first. And so Curbello, is well known to us here at E&E News. He put forward one of the first Republicans in a decade to put forward a carbon tax bill. He voted against Steve Scalise's resolution that described carbon taxes as detrimental to the U.S. economy. And, he's pushing back against his opponent. And what she's doing is she's no. Being a good enough Republican is not good enough. And that is the argument that she's trying to make in a district that Hillary Clinton won by 16 percentage points. And right now, I think I saw that spending in that race is one of the biggest in the country for a House race by far.
And what she's trying to do is basically, I heard an interview saying, convince as many people as possible that Curbello is not, right enough on the issue, and then turnout
Right, right, and that's what, and she appeared at this rally that I appeared at Florida, like International University. You know, she was there with Gillum, she was there with Bill Nelson. They were all trying to get the students to come out and vote. You know, Sierra Club was there, all talking about, you know, it's great to talk about resiliency or to like put forward a carbon tax bill, but that is not what needed to be able to address like some of the warnings raised in the latest UN report. That you need to go beyond that. You need to do more of that. And they're making a very partisan argument here. They're like, look, you know, if you want to deal with climate change, all you can do is trust Democrats here. And you know, in a base turnout election, that might be enough. I mean, I know a lot of the special interest groups and the lobbying groups up here. They don't like that idea. They would rather have like some sort of bipartisan solution to push, but you know, not in the campaign trail. You're not seeing that right now. It's impressive. And so, I mean, I think that, you know, Florida is going to be so important for people who watch the environment, who watch climate on election night, that people need to pay attention to it. And not just because of all these issues, because of red tide and green slime and rising sea levels and hurricanes. I think it's important to watch because you're starting to see a state and its political apparatus deal with climate change and then address it. And how they address it is interesting. You know, do they take a Ron DeSantis approach of build that seawall?
Yeah.
Do they just go for resiliency? Do they not worry about it? They're like, hey, it's Florida. We've dealt with swamps and mosquitoes and hurricanes and the humidity for as long as people have been there. We can deal with climate change too. We'll just build more walls. Or will you actually see an effort to try to mitigate it more through carbon taxes and other examples? And I don't know. But I mean, really, I mean, this is, you know, there was a county mayor or county commissioner down there that appeared at a convention who said, you know, look, very true. We're the canary in the coal mine. And that's very true. I think politically and as well as like through infrastructure down in Florida.
One of the things I want to ask you is, you know, there's a lot of conventional wisdom up here in DC, and we go down to the states to, you know, try to see what things are. One of them was, you know, that Trump was the only thing that got DeSantis, you know, to win the primary, and you mentioned that another factor was his opposition to Big Sugar. What's another thing that might have surprised you, or that surprised you when you went down to Florida?
Well, I think that it's still a lot of. I talked to a couple of folks who were involved in the maritime industry. I talked to a guy who does kayak tours, you know, right in the Sarasota area that got hurt pretty badly by red tide. I spoke to another guy who does like fishing tours and charter tours, and I felt that these folks like, well, you know, what do you think about climate change? What do you think about red tide? Like who's to blame? What do you want to see happen? And you know, the line that I heard from at least these two folks, again, not a huge sample size, but you know, some of the few people I talked to was like, this is just part of the natural cycle. You just have to understand this more. That this doesn't have to do with whatnot. And it was interesting. I felt that some of these folks might have been maybe more kind of in touch with the science and more in touch with that, but they're not. Well, at least these two people were not. And so I mean, that tells me I wonder if you know, Democratic messaging on this is being tuned out. That, you know, some of the other folks like, you know, try to talk of this about being tuned out. You know, in a way, you know, I want to talk to kind of like Tom Steyer's group, which is spending boatloads of money to try to get Andrew Gillum elected. You know, are they encountering the same down there? Are they encountering that same resistance of, you know, this is just what happens.
Exactly.
You know,
as we've seen elsewhere in the country, that you have people who are seeing the effects and still are not buying the signs.
Yep.
Exactly.
Yeah. It's wild. And you know, again, the kayak guy. I was like, well, what do you think about, you know, Governor Rick Scott? He's okay. I was like, well, what do you think about Senator Bill Nelson? He's okay. I was like, well, who are you going to vote for? I don't know.
There's still a lot of undecideds that you know of.
You know, I haven't looked at the polling recently to know exactly, but I would be surprised if they were at this stage in the game a large number of undecideds, particularly since voting has already started.
That's true. That's true.
You know, where people are already putting ballots in. So, I mean, it is, like I said, if you follow the climate change space, if you follow the environmental space, you should be watching Florida on election night, because that is going to be the state that's going to be the most interesting.
And you will have a story on it coming up in Climate Wire, a preview setup from your trip.
Yes.
In the coming days.
My editor would like to know specifically when I'm going to finish it, but right now, it's a thought piece about a state dealing with climate change. There's a lot to unravel.
And the elections are next week, so it's going to have to be before then.
Exactly.
Sometime before that.
Before Tuesday.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
And you can catch Mark's story in the coming days in Climate Wire, and for all our coverage of the midterm elections, just go to enenews.net. There's a reports button on the right side of the page, and that should take you to our report page, which we're actually working on making even more user-friendly. So we might have an update on that in the next also coming days. Thank you very much for watching. We'll be back here soon.
Cut.